Okay, excellent. So, a long time ago, I was interested in NLP and hypnosis. So, I took courses in hypnosis. I took courses in NLP. I got Richard Bandler's autograph. I was so excited about it. Then I began learning about Milton Erickson. I was watching his videos and old VHS tapes and audios from way back when. And I was so impressed actually because his knowledge was just so extraordinarily deep. And I didn't know that it was that penetrative. But his understanding was just, it was like the clouds of fog and confusion were just parted, and he was just able to see through people and their communications so extraordinarily clearly. So now I get an opportunity to speak to one of his proteges, his students, Mr. Bill Hanlon. So I'm like tremendously honored to speak with you, and thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're like in holiday in Caribbean. So, anyways, I just wanted to.
I am. Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. But yeah, I once heard Jay Haley, who is also a student and protege of Milton Erickson, say, I feel as if I understood even half of what Erickson did, I would be a much better therapist. And I was a little surprised. Like, you've written books about him, you studied with him for years. You didn't understand half of what he did. I think I understood more than half, partly because of Haley, who helped me understand some of it. But he had some amazing abilities, and he had this sort of psychotic optimism that any problem could be solved. You just had to find a creative way around it. And he was extremely creative and extremely weird in a certain way, too, I will say. I studied with him. I met him, I was an undergraduate student at Arizona State University, and I met him when he came to the gallery where I worked, the art gallery where I worked on campus. I was a work-study student. I was working my way through university. And he came with his wife and his daughter. He was in a wheelchair by that time. He'd had polio earlier in his life, and then he had what they thought was a second bout of polio in the late 40s, and he moved to Arizona for his health. But it turns out they know more about it now. It's post-polio syndrome, where you get a bounce back after 20 years, 30 years, whatever, 10 years. And he had gotten paralyzed again, like he did the first time with polio. He learned to walk again, but he was in his later years. He was in his late 60s, early 70s, and he was in a wheelchair. And so they brought him to the art gallery, and he wanted to go there for two reasons. One is he had a patient that had some art in the gallery, and second thing, he wanted to buy some. He collected Seri Indian carvings, which they sold at the art gallery store. They were from Sonora, Mexico, the native tribes down there. And the problem was, we were on the third floor, and this was back in the old days when they didn't have wheelchair accessibility for some places. And that was one of the places. And he really intended to get up there. So his wife and his daughter came up, and I was one of the workers there, and they asked me to come down to the parking lot where he was, showed me the wheelchair. He said, I really want to get up there. And I said, well, there is a possibility. We have a ramp that goes up to the third floor. There's no, it's just stairs, but there's a ramp that goes up to the third floor where we bring the art on a dolly up to the third floor. Now, it was a pretty steep ramp. It went from the ground floor to the third floor. But you could bring big paintings up there and sculpture. So I thought, well, we could probably, if his wheels would fit in there, and they would. It was big enough for that. So I got him up there. And, I was a skinny little guy, and he gained some weight being in a wheelchair. And that wheelchair was one of those old metal heavy ones. So it was challenging to get him up there. But I was like, I'm going to do this, and that's great. I got him up there. I didn't really count on getting him down, because it was almost straight down. And then when I looked at the very end, his wife and his daughter said, he's going to kill you. He's too small. That's too steep. And he said, I have faith the boy could do it. And I was like, you have more faith than I do. But I took it step by step, and we got him down there. And after he drove away with his purchases, my fellow student, work-study student, turned to me and said, do you know who that was? And I said, no, I have no idea. She said, well, you're in psychology. You should know him. He's a famous psychiatrist, Milton Erickson. I'm like, I've never heard of him. They never talked about him in my undergraduate. And as fate would have it, kismet, there was an article in Newsweek magazine that week called Svengali in Arizona. It was about Jay Haley's recent book that had just come out. This was 1973, and it was called Uncommon Therapy. And Erickson did a very uncommon approach to psychiatry and therapy and change, which NLP was in part based upon. And I read that, and I was stunned. I mean, I was just like, they are not teaching me this in undergraduate school psychology. And I was hooked, like you. I mean, when you come across, you're like, what? How does this guy? He's like a magician or a genius.
Yeah.
He's like a Sherlock Holmes of human psychology, and he's like Sigmund Freud with amazing hypnotic skills and understanding of the human condition, but more than that, understanding of how to change people. Freud was pretty good about analyzing people and sort of giving us some insight into how they ticked, but I think Erickson was the genius of change. And again, that's why the founders of NLP studied him, because he was one of the most effective change agents. They studied a few that they thought were really effective, and Erickson was, to me, the top change agent I've ever met. He just didn't give up, and he found, as I said, creative ways to come at any problem. And he just, I've written a number of books about Erickson's work, and I was studying his work, and it was a little intimidating because he seemed to solve every case. And I decided to research his failures. And he had a few failures, maybe out of 322 cases that I found, 3 or 4 failures. But he'd written an article about one of his notable failures. And the title of the article was Successful Hypnotherapy That Failed, which I loved. I mean,
yeah, it's typical Milton. Yeah.
Successful hypnotherapy. He was oriented towards solutions and success more than he was oriented towards failure or what didn't work. And so that was fascinating to me, because I was not so self-assured as a change agent, obviously. I had met people I couldn't help change, and I went on to graduate school, and I was a shy guy at the time, and I became a fierce advocate for paying attention to the positive sides of people, the resources that they had, the solutions that they had, the wisdom that they had, the inner knowledge that they had, instead of this bias, which was pretty clear with my professors and psychotherapy theories and methods at the time, which was, there's something wrong with people and you need to be the expert and fix it. Erickson was a great change person, but he wasn't the expert on people's lives. He had a way of evoking change from within, and I was a hippie at the time, and I was like, this is great. It's sort of ecological. You don't go in and mess with the ecology of a person. You go in and find what their ecology is, find the resources within that environment, and help change happen when they've gotten stuck. So I really was so attracted to this idea, but as we just talked about, mysterious, because like, how did he do that? He created a different approach for each person.
Right, individual.
I'm not that creative. Sorry, I would love to create a new theory and a new method for every person that comes to see me, but I'm just not that great. So I studied with him. I wrote him a letter. I studied with Bandler and Grinder before they created NLP in the 1975, 76, 77. And they said, what, you live right near him and you haven't gone to study with Milton Erickson? And I said, well, I'm just a graduate. What are you talking about? They said, just call him up. He's very accessible. I was like, call him up? This like genius? No, thanks. But I worked up the courage to write him a letter and say, I could maybe, work for you. I worked as a gardener between undergraduate and graduate school. I could work for you. I could write your story for Psychology Today, because nobody seems to know who you are. I'm in Arizona State, which is right next to where you live, right next to Phoenix. Most of my professors didn't even know who he was. And I'm like, it's this genius is living right here. And the rumor went around that he used to be great, but he was kind of senile. He was just strange, so they didn't know what to make of it. And I thought, well, the whole world needs to know about this guy. So I offered to do that. I was living with my roommate at the time who was in law school, and I was in graduate school for psychotherapy. And my roommate called. I came home from a weekend trip, and he said the strangest guy has been calling all weekend. But what? He calls early in the morning every morning. My roommate got up a lot earlier than I did, and he said he asked for the Hanlon gardening service. And when I tell him you're not here, he just hangs up. I said, "Oh, I think I know who that is."
Right. Yeah, he's not going to go through the pleasantries of, well, can you da-da-da-da-da-da. Right. Done.
No. And so the next morning, my roommate shakes me awake. And so I get on the phone, Hanlon gardening service. Yes, this is Bill Hanlon. And he said, and I said, "Is this Dr. Erickson?" He said, "Yes, this is Dr. Erickson."
Good impersonation.
You want to come to see me? I said, "Yes, I would like to come see you." He said, "How's Tuesday at 11?" And I was like, "Great." I had a graduate school class then, but I was like, "Oh, I don't care. I'm blowing that off." I get to meet the great Milton Erickson. I went out there, and I was, again, this is a little silly story, but I was a hippie, and I was dressed, I had really long hair, and I was dressed in my best hippie clothes, which is, all of us who are hippies know, John Lennon told us it was a white suit. Right. My girlfriend had made out of a McCall's pattern. It was a terrible suit. But he sent me, we talked for a little while, and then he asked me out to the garden. I wheeled him out to the garden. He wanted me to weed his garden, and I'm like, looking at my white suit, way too shy to say, like, let me go home and change into some blue jeans or, more appropriate clothes.
Right.
I worked at it, ruined that suit, which was probably his greatest gift to me. It was a terrible suit. It looked bad. But I then went out there every couple of weeks, and after about a month and a half of working in his garden, occasionally sitting and talking to him, his wife came out while I was working in the garden and said, "Milton, the boy wants to sit in on sessions. He wants to learn psychotherapy from you. Don't make him work at the garden the whole time." He's like, "Okay." And so I started sitting on sessions, and I studied with him for about a year in person. I'd read everything I could find on him. I'd gone to every workshop I could. By then, NLP was a thing, and I got certified in NLP. I was the editor of the first NLP newsletter from 78 to 80. Now, Erickson died in 80, March of 1980. And I moved away around that time from Arizona. But it had a lasting impact on my work. And later I went on to create my own sort of variation of one part of his work, because his work was quite complex, called Solution-Oriented Approach to Change. And it was more oriented towards what was right with people than what was wrong with people, their resources, strengths, and abilities, and their pathologies and deficits and wounds. Obviously acknowledging all that, but using a more positive pathway to change. And I wrote on that and teaching about Erickson and teaching about hypnosis, and I taught other things as well. And I traveled all around the world. I've done 3,800 talks and workshops all over the world, China and Australia and all over the States. The States is where I live most of the time. I'm in the Caribbean now. I have a winter home here. And all over the States and Canada and South America and all over Europe. And I loved introducing people to his work because it was so magical. And I had this mission to make him more accessible to people because he was so complex and so mysterious to people, such a wizard. And that's led me to write some books. I've written 41 books so far, 36 about change and psychotherapy, and the other ones are about songwriting, which is what I'm doing in my retirement here. Just trying to understand the legacy that he left and trying to pass that on to other people.
Wow, that's terrific. And excellent work cranking out all those books. I know it's not easy to kind of organize the thinking and get the outline going and sticking to it and going through the thought process and the depth and the wrangling with it. And so hats off to you. I've written 2 books, and every time I write, when I say, "Oh, never again," but next thing
you can't write one unless you have to write it, because you're right. I wasn't a natural writer. The first one took 3 years, blood on the keyboard. I hated every minute of it. I loved it when it was out. I love to have written. That's a Dorothy Parker quote. I don't like to write, but I love to have written. And that was certainly true for me. after I did about 17 books, it got way easier, and I usually can write a book in a few weeks to a month, the draft of it, and then I'll spend some time revising it, and it's not as painful as it was. But yeah, I feel this, as soon as I learn something, I feel this incredible desire to share with other people, which is partly why you're doing your program in bringing to people things they should know about that you get excited about.
Yeah, and making it more accessible. Like I find like reading Milton was just so deep, and I would need half an hour just to go through like a couple sentences because he's just cramming so much intense information all at once. So I needed some time to kind of disentangle it and then internalize it and embody it. And then once I get it, I feel like, okay, well now I'm not in a wheelchair. I can talk about this in a different way that Milton could, and maybe that makes it a little bit more easier to digest. So when you skipped out on class Tuesday at 11 and you got to spend time with the Wizard of the Desert, after spending time with Milton, were you thinking, man, like, was psychotherapy not as alluring to you once you've got, I mean, like, no offense, but like school must have been like cubic zirconium, and here you got Milton is like a diamond. It's like, was that a bad metaphor?
I thought I should learn all those theories, because they were part of the whole thing. But
sure.
Shy as I was, I started to argue with my professors.
I believe it, of course.
You're so focused on the DSM and what's wrong with people, find the diagnosis, that the part of it, I remember in graduate school, I had one professor who was kind of cool. She was a nursing professor, actually. And I took a psychotherapy course in her nursing department. And she gave us an assignment. We were supposed to study the theories and methods of psychotherapy. And she said, okay, why don't you do a semester paper? You're pretty much on your own here. We'll go over the theories in class. But I want you to pick one person that one approach that you really like, and write a semester paper on it. And the first half would be their theory of pathology, like what is wrong with people. And your second half should be their theory of change. And I picked Erickson, of course. When I went to do it, I was screwed because he almost had no theory of pathology. I shouldn't say none, because I found a little. But that was one page. It was supposed to be a 40-page paper.
Right.
And one page, and it was supposed to be half. And I talked to her, and I said, sorry, I picked the wrong guy, I guess, but I'm sort of committed now. And she goes, oh, that's okay. Just put your one page in there and then spend 39 pages on his theory of change, which was doable.
Sure.
Because he had lots of approaches to change. And I was really interested in ferreting those out because, as you said, he was so mysterious and overwhelming and intimidating in a certain way.
Right.
And so I love that. But he was more focused on the change part of psychotherapy than the problem and the diagnosis and the theory part of psychotherapy, the theory of how problems develop. And so that did make me a little bit of an annoyance for my teachers, because I was like, okay, well, once you've got their diagnosis and you've analyzed them, well, how do you help them change? And they were very light on that part of the equation.
Sure, so right.
I was like, get out of this master's program as soon as I can, go out and help people, and forget these professors who knew theories from 20 years ago that I didn't think were that great anyway. And I loved Erickson's work, as you said. I mean, I was so enamored of it that I was like, I can't wait to move on. And then right after I got out of graduate school, I was shy as the day is long. As I mentioned, when I wanted to write him a letter, I got so mad about what was going on in psychotherapy and how ineffective and biased towards the negative and what was wrong with people it was. I started speaking and teaching like within a year after I got out of graduate school.
Wow, what a difference.
And I was terrified to stand up in front of people, but that's my gesture thought. I was terrified to stand up in front of people, but I was more angry and passionate about sharing this work. And I stood up there and shook for a little while. And then as soon as the workshop got going, I was more relaxed and I was okay. And the first one I did, people were like, this is great. When are you going to do the advanced one? And I'm like, what? So I became a reluctant speaker. And then after a while, I got really good at speaking. And that's why I traveled all around the world. After 8 years of speaking, people kept coming up to me, where's your book? I'm like, I don't know how to write. I'm too hyper. I don't know how to write a book. I've never done it. And they were like, we need a book. And I'm like, oh, man. So I was like, no, no, no. For, about 8 years, I was telling people that. And finally, I was like, I guess I had to write a book. I mean, so I did. And that started me off. And the first one was terrible, as I said. The second one was easier. Third one was easier. About 10, I did one a year for 10 years.
Wow.
I had so much I wanted to communicate and so many ideas. And they were all getting published. I had good publishers, in New York, major publishers, W.W. Norton and Guilford and some other ones. W.W. Norton published a bunch of my books, and, it was a pretty big publisher, and I was making money from my books, and I was selling them at my workshops, and I was like, this is good. I was an old hippie, and I'm making money. What? This is cool. Not therapist money, but actual money. So,
right.
I loved it, and then I got really into that, really into teaching, and I started to sell audios and other things. I became sort of an entrepreneur, which I'm just going to be a therapist.
A hippie therapist. What are you doing getting into business?
I know, I'm making money. What the heck? It's weird. And so I did that for about 30 years. I traveled all around, and I loved every minute of it, but I was a little too married to it. And my relationships suffered, both my friendships and my kids. I had 4 kids, 3 stepkids and a biological kid. My relationships and with my partners suffered. I was married a couple times, and after the second divorce, I was like, I'm married to my work. I need to find another way to do this thing I'm passionate about. So it was early days, but about 17 years ago, I learned how to put things online, and I studied with the masters of internet marketing. Some of them were sleazy, and I didn't want anything to do with it. And I finally found my master, who really taught me a lot. And I made so much money putting my work online that I never had to work again. Hence why I spend 6 months in the Caribbean every year and 6 months in Santa Fe, although I go back and forth to Nashville because I decided to take on a new challenge when I stopped my psychotherapy teaching career after a while and mostly stopped writing psychological or self-help books. I decided to see if I could master a new career, which I'd done when I was younger, and that was songwriting. And I'm deeply into that at this point, and using the principles that I learned from Erickson about how to change,
right,
how to master something, the things that I learned about how to master hypnosis, how to master psychotherapy, how to master book writing and speaking, and online work. I thought I've learned how to learn, and I've learned how to succeed at something. So now I've written in the last 7 years, I've written almost 1,800 songs. I have 113 of them recorded by artists out in the world, and I have had 14 of them in TV and movies and commercials and things like that. And I'm having the time of my life. And again, I don't need to do it for money, although they send me money, and I don't mind that at all. And I just am having a great time in my later years here, finding some new passion that excites me, like Erickson excited me for 30 some years.
Right. It's incredible. When you were writing your songs, there's no way that it could not have influenced, but the lyrics are going to have an influence. There's going to be some kind of hypnotic influence in there on your lyrics and where you're taking the listener.
Yeah, well, there is a rhythm to hypnosis. And
right.
there are obviously to lyrics and music. And I think one thing I learned by being in trance so much, when I was doing trance with people, I would go into my own kind of trance, and then having experienced trance a lot with Erickson and other people.
Wow.
I learned, Erickson had this kind of different view from Freud of the unconscious. Freud's was more scary. It's like, it was the Mr. Hyde to the Dr. Jekyll of our ego.
Well said.
It was kind of scary, deep id, your primal instincts, which were sometimes pretty scary. You had to have an ego and a superego to guard against that deep, scary unconscious, subconscious. Erickson had a more benevolent view of the unconscious. It was your creative unconscious. It was sort of like, his view was, mostly it was a warehouse of everything you'd ever learned in your life. How to walk, how to talk, how to focus, your eyes, anything you had ever learned, language, obviously, and reading and writing and anything, riding a bicycle, anything. And he thought hypnosis was a way to evoke that creative unconscious to solve your problem. So he had a more benevolent view of the unconscious. And when I started songwriting, I knew techniques to get out of my way, because obviously in any creative endeavor, you've always got that critic that goes, "Oh, this sucks.
Right.
You're terrible. We've all got that kind of stuff." And I just know ways to bypass that and get straight to my non-angsty creative channels. And then later you go back and edit, which is a good thing to do, because you've got to have a critical eye at a certain point if you're going to do commercial music, which I do. And so I learned that, certainly. But the other thing is, a lot of songs are about relationships. They're about life.
Yeah, I mean, like, love is like an 80% of the top.
Longing for love, getting over a heartbreak, being in love. And I was a couples therapist in addition to doing hypnotherapy and individual therapy for 40 years. So I've got the insights and even the stories, although I don't break anybody's confidentiality when I write, but I sort of know what's real in a love story or a heartbreak story or a troubled relationship story. And then in a general life way as well. I've written about depression, I've written about fear, I've written, all these things that we encounter both personally in our lives and that one encounters as the therapist. And so I know when things ring true and I have a million stories.
Yeah. Well, let's get into some of those stories. One thing you said was that Milton was weird and creative. So I see a lot of he's always wearing purple. I think he's colorblind, right? So just to make sure everything matched, everything was purple. So when I was reading his books, I remember he'd have one client that was an alcoholic. Another guy was afraid to leave the city, so he made the guy drive to the edge of town and lie down in a ditch. Another guy, he told him to go in the desert and just hang out with the cactus. And by doing these weirdo things, next thing you know, the boozer has stopped, and the other guy's traveling around, and they can't figure out, how come I had to lie in the ditch and go in the desert? How did that fix the thing? So
yeah, those stories are fascinating. I had a friend who wasn't a therapist, my roommate, that had said that he's on the phone. Years later, he had a child, and he would read her Milton Erickson stories out of those books for her bedtime stories. And you're going to warp that kid for life. Those stories were mesmerizing, so to speak. I mean, they were fascinating. I'll tell you one that I really loved.
All right.
This is the weirdest one. Erickson was Norwegian in his culture, in his ethnic background. And one day, this guy comes to see him. And this guy says, "The reason I've come to see you is you're another wooden head." I had no idea that was a sort of a name that Norwegians gave each other, like hard-headed guys.
Okay.
"You're another wooden head." And I've tried other therapists, and nobody's been able to help me. Here's my problem. He hands Erickson a scrapbook. This is in, probably the 50s. And this guy was a World War I flying ace. He was one of those guys who went up in those rickety planes and shot down Germans.
Right, Red Baron type, yeah.
Yeah, and so he was a war hero.
Right, Top Gun.
After the war, he became a profound alcoholic. He was still in the service. Nobody wanted to kick him out because he was this, war hero, but he never progressed. People sort of felt sorry for him. He was miserable, and he just drank himself into oblivion. And he would go out on binges every once in a while. And then he'd sober up, and he'd go for a binge. So Erickson looks at the scrapbook, hears his story, takes the scrapbook, which is all of his, World War I flying exploits, and all the newspaper articles are about him, takes it, throws it in the wastebasket. The guy's like, "What? What are you doing? That's my life." He goes, "No, that is a war hero's life. You're just a drunk. You're a lush." The guy's like, "What?" He goes, he had found out that guy usually started on a binge by getting 2 Boilermakers. I'm not a drinker, so I had to learn what a Boilermaker was. It's a beer with a shot of hard liquor.
Okay.
You take the beer and you drink it, and then you take a shot and you drink it. It's a quick way to get drunk. So this guy would order 2 Boilermakers. That's how he'd start on his benders, where he'd go off on a drinking jag. So Erickson said, guy is really mad at him for throwing his stuff. He grabs it out of the wastebasket. And Erickson says, "Now I want you to leave this office, my office, walk to the nearest bar. I want you to order 2 Boilermakers. And pick up the first beer and say, here's to that bastard Milton Erickson. Drink it down. Pick up the first, shot and say, may he drown in his own spit. Drink it up. Pick up the second beer. Here's to that bastard Milton Erickson. Drink it down. Pick up the second shot. Say, may he rot in hell. Drink it down. The guy's like, F you. Leaves the place. Just slams the door as he leaves. Walks to the nearest bar. Goes in there. Orders 2 Boilermakers. Damn it. I thought I was going to get dry, but I'm not. This guy has dissed me. And I'm
wooden head.
So angry. Orders the 2 Boilermakers. Cannot drink them. Cannot drink them because, number one, Erickson told him to, and you don't want to give that bastard the satisfaction of being right. Number 2, he can't drink them without hearing that voice in his head. Here's to that bastard Milton Erickson. It spoiled his ritual.
Right.
His ritual is to feel sorry for himself and get drunk. And now he can't do that. And he stopped drinking, and I'm like, I don't think that's the AA method of getting. I would get kicked out of my profession for doing that.
Right.
But it was, there's this because you read some of this stuff. There's 500 stories like that.
Yeah.
You're just like, what? How did he know to do that? How did he know that it would work? Why did it work? And it's just, you could spend a lifetime studying this. And it made me a lover of stories as well. And that's part of what connected us because I sent out all the things saying I've got this free 1 hour, now that I've retired, I have this guy who's taken over my online courses. And every month I said, well, I'm fine, I'm retired, but let's record something that I've never recorded before to leave this legacy that I want to leave about his work and about the things that I've learned about change and things like that. And so and he gives 1 free continuing education credit for change agents and therapists, which is great. And so we just give away a free webinar every month. And, I add people to my email list, so it's not entirely benevolent. I get something out of it because then sometimes I send out emails about my paid courses and other courses that other people are doing, which I get affiliate fees for typically. So I was not a storyteller, I was not a joke teller, and I had to learn to tell stories. And you've heard me tell a few out here, so I can tell a pretty good story.
Yeah, for sure.
Stories are a side door into change.
Yeah.
If I told you, okay, your thinking is all screwed up, you're doing a lot of negative thinking, you got to change that, that works with some people. It doesn't work with a lot of people. Most people are a little opposition when people tell them what's wrong with them or what to do. But if you tell a story, somebody might take something from that story, even that you didn't intend, but it can evoke something. And stories are evocative. And I learned the evocative approach to change from Erickson rather than the directive approach to change, saying, you need to exercise more, eat better, you need to watch your thoughts because you have negative thoughts, you need to do that. He wasn't a prescriptive guy like that. He was more of an evocative guy. And it took me a few years because almost every other psychotherapy approach, diagnosis, what's wrong with you, what it is that screwed you up, what it is that you're doing wrong, mentally, psychologically, cognitively, behaviorally, and then tries to fix that. Erickson was not into that. He was into, you have one of the books that was written about Erickson's work was called The Answer Within. You have the answer within, and my job as a change agent is to evoke your natural resources to help you change. And that was a revolution because I was no longer the expert who had to diagnose things correctly, figure out how to fix them and fix them correctly and direct that change. I was the person who created an environment where you got access to, and you got empowered to change yourself in a way, again, that was ecologically sound. It wasn't me imposing my morals or values. I mean, from the beginning of psychiatry and psychotherapy, there have been cultural and gender biases. Women had to have penis and vagina orgasms or they were immature orgasms. That's a crazy idea, but men started psychiatry and so they developed these crazy ideas about women. And, There was even an extreme example of some psychiatrists in the United States diagnosed slaves who ran away as having a psychological disorder because they couldn't accept their slavery. It's like, I mean, those are extreme examples, but that's in minor ways. We often impose our own cultural, personal, gender biases, racial, class biases to people we work with. The evocation way bypasses that because you're not telling people what to do, or even implying that they're wrong for doing it the way they do.
Wow, yeah. Do you think that it's pretty much impossible or close to, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't use it total extreme, but to create another Milton? And here's where I'm coming from this. I think that technology has inhibited our ability to be more acute. And by that, I mean, people used to be more social. You read old books and Charles Dickens, the way he held his hat and his head and the tip of the thing, and I knew he felt like this. Whereas we don't speak like this. We're not as face-to-face as much. Our social capabilities have been reduced. And because of that, our awareness of each other and the intuitions, in other words, the mapping that's going on in the other person, we're not as capable of reading it just because we're not accessing it as much. So with Milton, he had more people, but he was also having polio, so he had to rely on subtleties and being able to absorb all these tiny little nuances. And I think people nowadays just can't do that.
Yes, it's funny because some of the work I've done is about how a wound, I mean, it's not totally original to me, but how a wound can lead to your greatest gifts. And yes, Erickson had polio in which he was paralyzed. And there are two stories, I think, that explain him. I don't know if it's just nobody could have that kind of same thing happen, or it's really the confluence of him in his time, as you say, and the wounds that happened to him. One of them was he was paralyzed by polio when he was 17. And he was bored out of his mind because he was paralyzed. And so he just learned to use his powers of observation, you say. He would play a little game with himself, and when people were coming along the hall, he had a big family, like eight siblings, I think, 7 or 8 siblings. He would predict who it was by their footsteps. So he learned to do that. He learned to move again because he found himself daydreaming one day, and he looked down, and his arms started moving in response to a memory of climbing a tree. And he was like, wow, that's interesting because I can't move volitionally because I try and move and I had my neurological system disrupted by polio. But my arm can move in response to unconscious memories, in response to memory.
Right.
So how can I evoke those memories? And he learned to vividly imagine scenes and then watch how the blood would flow to a certain part of his arm or his hand right before it twitched and moved. So he learned to make subtle distinctions that most of us don't.
Right.
And I don't know whether it's so much the product of his time or it's the product of his circumstance that made him the Sherlock Holmes of nonverbal behavior. And he used that to great advantage when he was a psychotherapist, because he had made so many of those minute observations that most of us, whether we're looking at our phones or not, I mean, I didn't grow up with phones like that in your hand and not looking at the world. They call it screen world. I heard the story about Japanese tourists who went to the Grand Canyon and never actually saw the Grand Canyon.
Ugh.
They only saw it mediated by screens. They went home and saw what they would have seen if they put down the phones and looked at the Grand Canyon, which was awe-inspiring, of course. But, we do mediate a lot of things through screens, but I don't think, I grew up, I'm younger than Erickson, but I grew up in a place, a time where there wasn't a lot of screens to distract us, TV, I suppose, but we didn't watch it all the time, didn't carry it around with us. I think he had a special circumstance that made him an acute observer, like Sherlock Holmes, of little nonverbal tells. And he used that. It wasn't the only thing he used, obviously. He did learn to use his creative unconscious. That's how he learned to walk again, which is a longer story I won't get into. But he learned to walk using that creative unconscious to re-evoke muscle memory so he could learn to walk again when they told him he'd never walk again. He also had kind of an oppositional personality. And when the doctors told his mother, he's right outside his room, the boy is going to die tonight. We didn't die tonight. And he was like, I'm going to prove those smug bastards wrong. Then the next day they came back and said, okay, he didn't die tonight, but he's not gonna ever walk again. And he was like, I'll show those smug bastards.
Oh yeah.
And he learned to walk again. So it was a little bit of that oppositional, I'll show them, I'll make them wrong. He had a little of that in his whole life. I'll do it my way and I'll show them that they're all wrong. And at the time he was disabled, as they called it, people avoided him. They wouldn't look at him because he walked with a limp, and finally he was able to walk, not get out of a wheelchair. He was able to walk with crutches. And people, anybody who was a cripple, they avoided, and they didn't treat him like they were normal people, like they'd talk loudly. I said, there's nothing wrong with his ears. He just has canes. And so I think he developed this kind of reaction to that he was going to be better than those bastards and show him he was smarter, more capable than him. And it drove him in his career in a certain way. He did amazing things because he had to. It's like what they say about Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, but she had to do it backwards and in high heels. And so, walking backwards and in high heels, Erickson had to do it with these very challenging physical disabilities, including what you mentioned earlier. He was colorblind, he was tone deaf, and he made the most of those disabilities to develop his other abilities in a hyper-acutive way, And so, unless I'm willing to get polio and, go through that and be paralyzed, I probably won't develop that same kind of acuity,
Do you think if he didn't have polio that he'd be as sharp? Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, that's good.
If he didn't have polio, do you think that he would have still reached that same heights of accomplishment? No.
I think he would have been a farmer, a creative guy, and he would have found cool solutions in farming. But no, I think that being paralyzed like that, deciding it could be a farmer, because he just didn't have the physical wherewithal for it, changed the trajectory of a career, and he always had the backup plan of being a doctor out of a particular painful experience he had when he was younger, and a doctor was kind to him and helped him. And he thought, well, if I can't be a farmer, being a doctor is a great thing. Like, they're amazing. And so I think that changed the course of his career, and I don't think he would have developed in the same way if he didn't have those problems, which, you've lived a few decades, and so have I. We see that, you can take those wounds that you have and those problems that you have and, sort of say, oh, woe is me, or you can say, wow, I'm so glad I grew up and this happened to me, even though it was a terrible thing at the time. It led to this amazing thing that happened in my life. I met the woman I fell in love with because, I got fired from my job or whatever, and sometimes it's a more minor thing, but we've seen it over the decades we've been alive, is that those things, if you take them and transform them into a gift, can be the best things in your life, even though you don't want to wish them on other people or they weren't fun to go through. And Erickson did that in spades. I mean, he did this amazing thing with the wounds that he had and the traumas that he suffered.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It reminds me also too of that guy John Walsh. He was a guy, and his son was kidnapped and found dead in a trunk. And then he created, helping to find missing children, and he's saved like over 300 kids or something. So it's like he went through this personal nightmare, but he's flipped it around to kind of help hundreds and hundreds of people not go through that horrific experience. And I think with Milton
one of the things that I think changes post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic success is, can you make a contribution into the world from the thing that wounded you or hurt you? It's one of the factors. I think there's three factors, but it's one of the factors I think that shifts things from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic success. And one of his contribution, there's two others, I think.
Yeah, post-traumatic growth is a big thing. One of the things also was better relationships with people and having a sense of humility. Like, I was at the top, now I'm at the bottom. Now I kind of understand people that are at the bottom, and I want to help them up because I've been there, and this kind of thing.
So the 3 C's, if you want them really quickly, are connection, compassion, and contribution. Compassion, what you just talked about. If you go through something and you become more defended and more angry and want to hurt, other people, or say, I don't want those bastards to get what I have, you become more self-concerned and less concerned about others, and that leads to more post-traumatic stress, I think. And connection, it's natural for us to disconnect when we're traumatized or hurt, but can you make deeper and better connections with yourself, others, and something beyond you through after a terrible experience? Those are the three things that I think shift post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic success. I wrote a book about it. That's why I know the things I think about it pretty clearly.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research about post-traumatic growth because I was interested in people that had a relationship that fell apart and they were able to kind of get their stuff back together. Sort of like Catherine Bigelow. She was married to the Terminator guy, James Cameron. They split up.
Yeah.
He made the Avatar movie, which is the highest grossing movie of all time. And she made a movie called The Hurt Locker. And both of them were nominated for Best Movie of the Year. And she won. You know? Yeah. So.
Yeah. I saw both of those movies. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, no, it's terrific. So, like, resilience to me is like there's like a superpower, which is like that Napoleon Hill quote of every adversity carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. And he embodies that not only for himself, but he gave that to others too. So yeah, it's incredible. What metaphors do you love that you like to use that are you keep in your back pocket so that when you hear that problem, you're like, oh yeah, I know.
Well, I do have a few favorite ones. You're right. I mean, two. I'll just give you quickly. We should probably wrap this up.
I want to talk about your course too and bring that into the course. So, how about two stories, and then we can course it, and then.
Okay, that's great. So, when I was growing up, I grew up in a big family, big Irish Catholic family, 8 kids, and my parents had this thing where, like, when you were 18. You left home, because they needed your room partly. And, they like sawed off your corner of the table, broke your plate and said, you go out and work or you go to college. So I was the runt of the litter, as I was saying, super shy. I went 2,000 miles away from Chicago area down to Arizona where I met Milton Erickson. I went to Arizona State. And my dad then, while I was down there, developed cancer. And, those Nebraska winters, he'd moved to Nebraska where he grew up, were really hard for him when he was on chemotherapy. So I said, well, come down to, Arizona. The winters are mild here and they won't be as hard for you. So he came down for 3 months in the winter. And my dad was a storyteller. So I got out a tape recorder and I recorded everything, and he'd tell the family stories and his favorite stories. And one time we were out to breakfast and I didn't have my tape recorder with me. I didn't know he was going to tell a story, but he told a story that stuck with me since then. He said, I've learned one thing from raising 8 kids, and I didn't have any kids at the time. I was like, one thing, someday I want to get married and have kids. What is that one thing? He said, I learned all you kids have to hit a brick wall, and that's how they learn about life. I go, what do you mean they have to hit a brick wall? He said, all of you kids. He said, it's like you see your kids about to make a mistake that could have a negative impact on the future, and it's like they're riding a motorcycle heading for a brick wall. And you, the parent, you got a little more years behind you, and you got a little wisdom, and you go, look out, stupid, you're heading for a brick wall, you're going to mess up your life. And he said, I would yell at them, and they would speed up on their motorcycle, and they'd give me a rude gesture, and then they'd hit the brick wall. And he said, I was stupid enough for my first 2 kids, those were my oldest brothers who paved the path for the rest of us. I stood in front of the brick wall while I gave my lecture. They'd hit me, and I would take some of the consequences of their mess up. And he said, then we'd have to pick ourselves back up, pick up the pieces, and try and fix it as best we could. And he said, after the first 2, I got smarter and stood to the side and gave my lecture. After about 6 of you, I got a lot smarter, and I said, look, I'm an old man, been around for a while. I think you're making a mistake. They were hanging out with the wrong people. They're doing drugs or alcohol. They're messing up in school, getting bad grades. They're doing something that's going to have some potential negative effect on their future. He said, I'm an old man. You probably won't listen to me. None of the other kids have. But I feel I have to say this. I think that's the wrong direction. I think you're going to pay a price you don't want to pay. And he said, so I recommend you go in a different direction. He said, they still didn't listen to me, but they slowed the motorcycle down, and they didn't give me the rude gesture. And he said, so after a while I realized this is just what kids do. They have to find out for themselves. And that was really helpful to me as a therapist. Sometimes you can't control the people you're working with. when sometimes I would tell them that story, sometimes it had a transformative effect on parents or on somebody who was married to somebody who was doing some terrible, drinking a lot or doing drugs or stealing or lying or whatever it may be. It's sort of like the Al-Anon model in a certain way. You can't really control them. You have to let them experience their consequences. Do not stand in front of the brick wall and buffer their consequences. So that story, I've heard it back to me from someone who came to study with me and said, oh, I heard this story one time of this guy, and I was like, that's my dad. And he goes, really? I just heard that as a story. Like, I thought it always existed. And I said, no, that was my story. But so that, and another one was more of a made-up story. When I was a teenager, I grew up Catholic, but I developed an interest in other religions. I started to doubt the faith I grew up in. And I used to read these terrible, cheap spiritual novels that I loved as a teenager by a guy named T. Lab Sangrampa. And they were a British series. I found them in a little, occult bookstore near where I lived. And I read every one of them. And they were about this British dentist who had the soul of a Tibetan Lama transplanted into him instead of being reborn. That he just fully incarnated into the body of a full-grown man. And so he remembered all of his previous incarnations, and he was the Dalai Lama at one point. And so, these. And later I realized, wow, these were so cheesy. But I loved it because I was learning all about Tibet and Buddhism and these other cultures,
novelty,
and these other ways of thinking. And I remember one story that really stuck with me, partly because I was so fearful and I was so anxious when I was a young person. In Tibet, in Buddhism in general, you can get enlightened. You get off the karmic wheel. You don't have to be reborn again and again. If you finally get enlightened, reach nirvana, you can go, I'll get off the karmic wheel. Have to stop. Don't have to get reincarnated again. Well, once every 100 years back in the old days in Tibet, they had a special ceremony. Usually you had to be die and be reborn again and get more wisdom and burn off more karma. And it took you many, many lifetimes to get to enlightenment. And they said, well, here's the lamas all got together, and the Dalai Lama, and they're all dressed in their fancy robes with gold and maroon, and the pointy hats, and all the students are dressed in their white robes, all the, who are studying to be lamas, get together, they say, okay, usually there's a pathway to get enlightened, you have to go through so many lifetimes, and this is a chance for instant enlightenment. You can get enlightened today by going through this ceremony that we're going to offer to you. It's called the Ceremony of the Room of 1,000 Demons. If you can go into the room of 1,000 demons, come out the other side, you will be enlightened and you can get off the karmic wheel. So what does it involve? Here's the room in front of you, and each of you have your own separate room. When you open the door, you walk in and there's 1,000 demons in that. And they have the ability to take on the form of your worst fears, your worst nightmares.
Oh my God.
The thing you don't want anyone to know, or that other people do know, that you're terrified. If you have a fear of heights, you're standing on the small ledge of a tall building and the wind is blowing and the ledge is crumbling. If you have a fear, if you're Indiana Jones, you have a fear of snakes, you're surrounded by scary, scary snakes. Whatever, spiders,
right.
whatever,
Yeah.
Whatever your fears are. And there are 1,000 of them. So they just start with your worst one and they keep going. So once you go in there, they have the ability to take the fears from your own mind and make them seem real to you. So all you have to do is get through the room. It's not that big, it's a regular sized room. And the door locks behind you, so you can't get back out the way you came. You have to walk through the room, find the other door, which is unlocked, and get out the other side. Well, most people get in there and they get paralyzed with fright and they stop moving. And they're tortured by their worst fears and die in the room. We can't come in and get you. That's part of the rules. So if you want to go home now, go. 3/4 of the students, just, I'll do it the regular way. I'll just go and meditate a little while. But about 1/4 of them stay there. So the Dalai Lama says, okay, you've stayed. And if you're willing to go through this, remember we can't come in. That's part of the rules. But if you get in there, remember 2 things that we've learned from students who've successfully completed this ceremony and passed every 100 years when it happens. One thing is, remember what the demons are showing you isn't real. It's a product of your own mind. They're just neutral. They just take the fears from your own mind. So these are your fears made manifest. The second one is, even if you can't remember that, remember this. Just repeat it to yourself and do it. No matter what you see, no matter what you feel, no matter what you hear, keep your feet moving. Because if you keep your feet moving, you'll get to the other side, find the door, and find your way out, and that's it. And I have told that story to probably 3,000 of my clients in psychotherapy. And for a few people, it's been, again, been quite transformative. You know, they'll come back and they'll go, I had a terrible week. And then they just get this little smile on their face, but I can't, my feet moving. And that becomes their mantra, keep your feet moving. And so those two stories have come back to me many, many times. And people, I'll see them 20 years later and they go, you know, you told me a story in psychotherapy I still think of every day and I use that every day. I go, what was that? They go, oh, your dad's brick wall thing, or you know, the keep your feet moving. And I have, 100 stories, but those are the ones that seem perennially popular. And, I like to tell them, you can see I get into it.
Of course.
And I learned storytelling. I wasn't a natural storyteller, but I learned storytelling. You can kind of tell on
I picked up on that. Yeah.
I'm pretty good at it at this point. So it's a learnable skill. So that's why my course, which is, call it a course, it's 1 hour webinar. And I just tell you how I systematically learn to structure stories, to figure out which stories are appropriate for which circumstances, and to tell a compelling story. Because there are elements to it that are learnable. I mean, good novelists do it, good movie makers do it, good business people do it, good
songwriters.
A lot of people who are really successful in life, you can use it in lots of settings. If you're a therapist, you actually get a free continuing education credit. But even if you're not a therapist, I think the webinar would be pretty cool. So to tell
definitely.
you the truth, I don't know how to get onto it. You could put the link in your notes because you have that link. You got an email from me.
Yeah.
But I think you might be able to go to BillO'Hanlon.com and it might be on there, but I don't think so, to tell you the truth.
I think it's on Psych-Maven. I'll put it in the bio. It'll all be there.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
So that's cool.
Yeah. So, with metaphors, those are two of them right there. Keep your feet moving. It's not about, is it my left foot? Is it my right foot? Do I point one to the door, one to the window? How does that make my life better? No, we internalize that. We say, well, what does that mean to me? And how does that relate to my life experiences? And how could I apply that to myself? And next thing you know, we're doing the thing without being told the thing. Or even implicitly knowing what that thing is. So...
Yeah. Definitely. Well, I've had people come back and tell me their take of that story. Their memory of it is totally wrong sometimes, totally different. It's totally wrong, and it was totally appropriate for them. So I love that because that's one of the things I like about stories. They're not so impositional. They're more evocative, and you personalize them to your own understandings. And sometimes they don't land. I mean, they don't really move you, but that's okay. It was just a story I was telling. It's like you're out with a friend, and they tell a story. But sometimes you're out with a friend 40 years ago and they told a story and you still remember it to this day. And
sure.
It meant something to you.
Yeah.
Some stories stick if they have a personal resonance to you and you go, wow. And I've used that story ever since when I get in this circumstance. That's the power of story. I mean, someone said we shouldn't call people Homo sapiens. We should call them Homo narrans, the storytelling and story making animal.
Definitely. Well, we are the meaning makers, so whatever we're making is coming from the story that we're telling ourselves or have told to us, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Excellent. Bill, thank you so much. This has been a tremendous pleasure, and it's been a joy to be spellbound by your stories. So thank you so much. It really is an honor. And is there anything else you want to add? Because I know you've got that course there, but you've also had other courses too, and books.
I created a bunch of courses and I put them online, and again, they were successful enough to let me not worry about money anymore in my life, which is great for an old hippie, because I didn't want to focus on money in my life, but I had to when I had a family and working life and all that stuff. So I'm back to that hippie sensibility again. And yes, I do a paid course every couple of months. Then one of them's on how to write a book and get it published. One of them's on how to be a paid speaker, because I did both of those things and mastered them pretty well. One of them's on Ericksonian hypnosis, solution-oriented hypnosis. One of them's on the solution-oriented approach to change. I mean, I just do them every couple of months, or actually someone else does them, which is why I don't know the details so much, because I retired those courses, and then somebody who'd been to them said, well, whatever happened to those courses? And he was a workshop sponsor, and he sponsored me in something. He said, I said, well, they're just sitting online. I'm totally into songwriting right now. He goes, can I take them over and we just share the revenue? And I'm like, yeah, great, go for it.
Oh,
And
excellent.
so, but I said, as a condition, I want to do a free webinar every 2 months because I want to leave a legacy of all this stuff I learned over 40 or 50 years in the wake of Erickson, and just to leave it behind because I hate it to die with me, and I don't want to write another book about that stuff. It's too small for a book, but I want to leave it, which is why this Metaphors Be With You, using stories for a change webinar was just one of those. I've never written a whole book about storytelling, and I don't want to. I mean, there are not a lot of books about storytelling, but I have a unique take on it. So I just want to leave those little pieces of legacy. I've got another one on evocation that I do, and just different things that are free. And he's kind enough to give a 1 hour credit for mental health professionals who need that, and that's great. And then we charge for courses every other month, so it's cool.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'll leave the link down below. So if anybody would like to learn more about Bill Hanlon's course and how to use stories for a change, that'll be there. Mr. Bill Hanlon, thank you so much. I really much appreciate that. And I know we had a bumpy start, but we finished strong.
And talk to you, Evan. So nice to meet you and talk to you. And nice that we share a lot of interests and we share a passion for Milton Erickson. Spread those ideas all over the world. I'll tell you, if you don't know Erickson, you're in for a treat. And you're in for being astounded and mystified in a certain way. So it's taken me a lifetime to unwind what I learned from him, and I love every minute. I'm still fascinated by him.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Bill. I'll talk to you another time.